Okay, good morning or afternoon or whatever it is where you are when you're watching this. So today for the second lecture, and this will cover basically the rest of this week. Keep an eye out on that storm, by the way, and make sure you do not go outside if things are rough, and be prepared. I'll also post on Canvas if anything changes. If classes get canceled on Wednesday, then we'll have to reschedule that lab training with Professor Bruner. So just look out for announcements about that on Canvas. And I'll also post these slides on Canvas as well. And as you're walking through this, as you're watching this, there are a few places where we normally have a discussion and have you guys work through things. Please do pause and take a minute to think about things. Take a minute to look, study a graph and make sure you understand it, because that type of thing is going to come up on quizzes and the exam, and I really want you to be able to learn those skills. So make sure you're taking that time to do that, and let me know if you have any questions. So today we're going to talk about evolution and the study of animal behavior. So behavior is something that oftentimes people don't really think of as, they think of it as very plastic, as very flexible. But in fact, as you'll see in our next lecture when I get back, many behaviors are genetically based, and they are prone to evolution like many other traits. And so they can evolve, favorable traits can evolve and become sort of propagated within a population. So these are the major concepts, excuse me, major concepts that we're going to talk about today, and these are kind of some of the main items that I want you guys to be familiar with. We're going to first talk about how evolution by natural selection favors behavioral adaptations that enhance fitness, like any other trait. We're going to talk about some different modes of natural selection, and then finally we're going to talk about sexual selection at the end, which we should come back to later in the semester. So first, evolution by natural selection favors behavioral adaptations that enhance fitness. So behavior, any sort of behavioral variation that enhances the fitness of an individual that possesses it should be favored. Evolution by natural selection, should favor those behavioral adaptations. So a few terms just to make sure you guys are familiar with these, and you should be. Natural selection, of course, this is when we have differential reproduction and survivorship among individuals within a population. So some individuals have traits that help them survive better than individuals who do not have those traits, and also traits that help them reproduce. Okay, so surviving without reproduction is pointless from an evolutionary standpoint. So that's natural selection. We'll talk more about that in a minute. When we say something is heritable, this just means that it's genetically based. Okay, and it can be passed from parents to offspring, and it's necessary for a trait to be heritable in order for it to evolve. It has to be genetically based and coded in the genes, at least in part. And in evolution, when we talk about evolution, this is just changes in allele frequency in a population over time. So remember, alleles are variants of a gene. So you have two copies of every gene, two alleles, and those might be the same copies. So you get one from each parent. You might have variants in those copies. So when we're looking at, when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about overall changes in the frequency of alleles in a population. And that can be driven by, some sort of favorable trait increasing in frequency, and then that allele that codes that trait is increasing in frequency as well. So natural selection favors it. So Darwin had these three postulates, or three conditions that he proposed were required for evolution to occur by natural selection. And if you were in 113 with me, we talked about these. First, variation exists among individuals in a population in the traits that they possess. So not everybody's the same. If everybody's the same, then there shouldn't be much non-random variation in survivorship. So you've got to have variation in traits. The second postulate is that excuse me, individuals who possess different traits, those traits are, at least in part, heritable, so they can be passed on from one generation to the next. Otherwise, the environment or the population can't really remember what the environment has selected for. It can't remember those traits that have been favored, and so they won't be passed on. Third, traits confer differences in survivorship and reproduction. Okay, so fitness, the likelihood of an individual surviving and reproducing is based on those traits that they possess. It's not random. Okay, so that's a super important part. So we got variation in traits. Those traits are heritable, at least in part, and those traits, differences in those traits cause differences in fitness, so that some traits are favored over others. And when those are favored, because they're genetically based, they can be passed on to their offspring. So this variation in species is very common. You could see this both phenotypically in terms of physical characteristics, anatomical characteristics. In this case, we've got a bunch of different guppies that vary pretty dramatically in their appearance. But variation also occurs in behavior within a population, and that can be selected and favored. So when thinking about heritability, we'll talk for a minute here about how heritability is measured. So one way to do this is through a parent-offspring regression analysis. So a regression analysis is a statistical analysis in which we are looking for the fit between two different groups in some sort of trait, in some sort of parameter. So in this case, we're examining the similarity between parents and their offspring. And so trait values of offspring, if something's heritable, then the trait values of offspring should be similar to the trait values of their parents. There should be a positive relationship between the offspring and parent trait values. So if you think about height, for example, if height is genetically based, if we were to look at the height of a bunch of offspring from a bunch of different sets of parents, there should be a positive relationship there. So if you've got short parents, you should have short offspring. If you have tall parents, they should have tall offspring. If you have medium-sized parents, medium-sized offspring, and so forth. We'll look at a graph that shows that in a minute. So here's an example of some work looking at heritability of exploration behavior in great tits. These are small passerine birds that live in many temperate areas. This study was done in Europe. So what they did is they had this sort of exploration arena, and there's a figure of it here, a little diagram of this over here. And they would let the birds out, and they would look at how many different trees, these fake trees that they landed on, how frequently they moved between those different trees. Essentially, they were trying to get an idea of how fast or how active they were exploring this new environment that they had not been in. So what I want you to do here is take a second, hit the pause button, and what I've got here is a blank graph. So on the x-axis there on the bottom is the exploratory score of the mother. So really low exploring on the left, really high exploring on the right, meaning they're jumping around a lot, checking things out. And then the heritability score of offspring. So imagine that we did lots of different pairs of mothers and offspring, and then we plotted as a scatter plot in this area right here, the exploration score of the mother and the exploration score of the offspring. So think about what this graph might look like if that exploration behavior is heritable, okay, based on what we've already talked about. So hit the pause button, take a second, start, draw it out on a piece of paper if you want to, and just think about kind of what this might look like. Okay, I'm moving on. So if you haven't taken a second to draw that out, do so now, or pause it and do so now. So this is what it actually looked like. And there was, as you can see, a positive relationship between, and this is a little messy, but there was a positive relationship between the mother score and the score of the offspring. So this indicated that it was a heritable trait. So the higher the exploration score of the mother, the higher, on average, would be the exploration score of her offspring, and vice versa. Another way to measure heritability are selection experiments, and this is oftentimes a bit more robust of a method. And what is done here is that you get different groups of individuals that are subjected to differential selection on whatever trait is of interest. So basically, you take two different groups, and you artificially select for different values of a trait in those groups. So if artificial selection acting on a trait results in changes in that trait value in subsequent generations, then that trait does have a genetic basis. And you could look at how strongly that trait responds to artificial selection, and that gives you some clues as to how heritable that trait is, how strong it's responding to selection. So how this works, you pick the individuals from the, with the desired traits, and then you breed them. Okay, so here's an example, again, from that work with those birds. It's a different experiment. So what they did is they took individuals that had similar traits initially, and then they looked at their offspring, and they selected either for the most high exploration score, the highest exploration scores, or the lowest exploration scores. And then from that set of offspring, they only allowed the really high or the really low ones to breed. And then they did that over and over and over again. And over just 4 generations, you could see that there's a really dramatic change within those groups. So they found really strong changes in exploration behavior, and that suggested that that was quite heritable. So this is a really good method. It takes a little longer. It takes more sort of lab work and breeding. You have to be able to do this. Generally, this only works with species that have kind of short generation times, where you can artificially select for certain traits and see how they respond. Okay, so variation within a population can be due to several things. One could be differences in genetic composition, so you have different alleles, and that causes individuals to be different. You could also have differences in environmental conditions. So we'll talk later about interactions between genes and the environment. But the environment, basically, if you live in a different environment, you might end up looking different or behaving differently, even if you have similar genes. But this third one, this is kind of unique to this field of animal behavior, is looking at differences in learning. So you might have variation within a population because individuals have learned or had more experiences than others, and that could lead to variation within a population. So before we talk a bit about that, I'm going to make a couple important notes. And the first one is that variation in traits might not actually affect fitness. And the second is that frequency-dependent selection can maintain different traits in a population. And we'll talk about each of those in a little bit more detail. But first, we could talk about this idea of differences in learning, how that could drive variation in behavior. So in this graph on the right, I've got foraging experience in days on the x-axis. So this is of honeybees. This is how much experience they have, how many days of experience they have going out foraging for pollen and nectar. And then on the y-axis is the mean rate of food delivery. Okay, so this is basically how successful are they at feeding. So take a minute here and answer this question. What do you notice about the rate of food delivery over time? So pause this, take a second, write down a quick interpretation of that graph. And we're moving on. So what you should see is that sort of by trial and error, these bees are learning, and that results in bees increasing their rate of food delivery. So they're basically learning how to forage, and that learning increases their efficiency. So if you've got variation in learning within a population or variation in experience, that could cause variation in some sort of behavior that's not necessarily genetically based. So that's important to keep in mind when thinking about behavior and how behavior evolves. Okay, so back to these 2 points that I made briefly. So the first is that some variation may not affect fitness. It might not have anything to do with the survival and reproduction, but there still could be behavioral variation or any other type of variation within a population. So here's an example of eastern screech owls. And there's a graph here. It's a little picture of the screech owl. And the graph on the right, what this shows is sort of the direction of dispersal when they are, I believe this is for juveniles, once they're dispersing from their nest. And so you can see that it's kind of random. They kind of go off in any direction. And that probably doesn't matter very much. It probably doesn't matter if they go off to the north or to the south or whatever in this sort of short-term dispersal. But there is variability in that behavior. So there's lots of other examples of that, of how variation might not actually impact fitness, which is interesting, but not if we're looking at sort of the response to selection. So this is a a really cool topic here, looking at frequency-dependent selection, and this can be a little bit, it's a little complicated, so let's take some time to make sure everybody understands this. So this can actually cause frequency-dependent selection can help maintain variation within a population. And we'll talk about a cool example of this in the wild. But basically what you've got here, we've got A on the left is an example of positive frequency-dependent selection, and then B on the right is negative frequency-dependent selection. So take a second here and look at this graph and see what you can interpret. So we've got trait frequency here on the x-axis for both, and then fitness on the y-axis. So in this case, what do you see about the relationship between trait frequency, how frequent a trait is, how common a trait is in a population relative to, and then how that impacts fitness, and then over here the opposite, how frequently how frequent that trait is in a population to what's the relationship between that and fitness. Just take a second, see if we can describe that. All right, so this should be pretty straightforward. Fitness of a trait increases as it becomes more common under positive frequency-dependent selection. So when there are more individuals with a certain trait in a population, having that trait is beneficial. Negative frequency-dependent selection is the opposite. So fitness of a trait declines as it becomes more common within a population. Okay. So hold on one second. I have to talk to my son about something. You done? My son was trying to steal a Roku remote for the little apartment that we're staying in and use it in the big house next door. I'm not sure it's going to work though. Okay, so here's some research, an example of frequency-dependent selection looking at salamanders. So in salamanders, there are a lot of different species that have similar polymorphism. So they've got striped and unstriped individuals. So here's two examples. On the left, this picture is an unstriped individual. On the right is a striped individual. So what gives? Why do we have these differences, or sort of the similarities in these polymorphisms across lots of different species? What's driving that polymorphism? Polymorphism, if you haven't heard that term before, that just means like many forms. Okay, polymorph. Morph is form or shape. So if you've got lots of different forms or lots of different colors, that's like within a population, that's a polymorphism. So the hypothesis that these guys proposed was that frequency-dependent selection via bird predation could maintain the polymorphism. And the idea here is that if you are really common, if you have a really common morph, then the predator, whatever that predator is, in this case birds, might start to sort of cue in on that pattern, and so they're more likely to find those individuals that are more common. So if they focus on that trait, if they get kind of a search image of individuals with that trait that's more common, then they should have they should be more. Sorry, I think my kids are about to run inside here. Okay, I'm going to pause this for a second. We'll be right back. Okay, picking up where we left off here. Okay, so this is picking off from the first part of the lecture, picking up, whatever. The hypothesis here was that the frequency-dependent selection should be maintained through predators, okay? So what they did was they did this as an experiment, they varied the ratio of striped and unstriped clay models, which attached some sort of food reward, okay? So they had these clay models, you can see this in the bottom right. There's a little clay salamander with a stripe and a little clay salamander without a stripe, and then they had food attached to one of these. And they placed these in the field, and they recorded the number of attacks on them by birds and mammals. And you can do this because this clay, once a bird comes in, they grab it, and you can see the marks and everything. and they knew where these things were, so they knew how many they had, and they could then vary the ratio of the striped versus the unstriped clay models. So these were the results, and I'm going to let you guys take a look at this for a minute. So pause it and see if you can figure out the pattern. So there's two different lines. One is the model frequency, and that's the line with the orange dots. And so for half the period, the striped model was at really low frequency, so the unstriped was at high frequency. And then the striped model was at high frequency for the second half. And that other line with the blue dots shows you the relative fitness of the individuals with the stripes. So see what you can figure out in terms of why that polymorphism might be maintained and why predators might have to have something to do with that. Okay, I'm moving on. So if you haven't thought about this for a minute and tried to figure this out on your own, hit pause and do so now. So the results here were that the less common model type had lower attacks, so they had higher relative fitness than the model type that was more common each day. So if we look at the first 6 days, the striped model was relatively rare, and so they had much higher fitness. They had lower attacks on them than the unstriped model. And then that pattern was reversed once, sort of starting day 8, you see the fitness start to drop of the models with the stripes because they were more and more common, which meant, or sort of indicates, oops, sorry, I thought we had another slide there, which indicates that this predation pressure might cause sort of this sort of flip-flopping in these different strategies, so that sometimes having one morphology, if you are less common in a population, might be more advantageous. And then in other cases, once the predators sort of figure out what's going on and they start to prey on these high frequency individuals, they'll have lower fitness, and then that low frequency morphotype will then sort of bounce back and become more frequent. And then once they become more frequent in the population, have a higher ratio in the population, they become less fit, and so on and so forth. So it kind of goes back and forth and back and forth, boomerangs sort of back and forth over and over again. So this is a good time to talk about these sort of complementary ideas of fitness and adaptation. So an adaptation, the word adaptation can mean two different things. We could be talking about the noun, sort of the thing, a trait, which is an adaptation, and that's just some trait that enhances fitness. And as you saw with that last example, sometimes that varies, and that's why we oftentimes talk about relative fitness, the fitness of some trait relative to another, and oftentimes that is context dependent. So an adaptation is a trait that enhances the fitness of an individual relative to someone who does not have that trait. This is also an evolutionary process that results in a population of individuals with traits that are best suited for their current environment. So you can think of that as sort of a trait of population evolving and adapting to a given set of circumstances, environmental conditions, and that's the process of adaptation. So fitness, we've talked about this before, but just to make sure you're clear in this context, we're looking at survivorship and reproduction. So that increase in relative fitness means that some individuals with certain traits are more adapted for an environment, and they tend to have higher survivorship and reproduction. Okay, so we're going to talk for a little bit now about modes of natural selection that describe different population changes that can occur within a population under different sort of types of different selection scenarios. So the first is called directional selection. So this is when individuals in a population with an extreme trait value at one end of the spectrum have the highest fitness. Okay, so you can think of this as sort of the biggest or the fastest or the brightest individuals within a population, if they have the highest fitness, and then that fitness sort of declines or decreases as you move away from that high extreme value, that would be directional selection. And so we're going to look at a couple different modes of selection. In each case, I'll have this fitness curve on the top with blue, and that will show you the fitness, the relative fitness of individuals with different traits along this x-axis, going from low to high. And then down here with the orange lines, there's actually going to be two different orange lines. this is like a frequency distribution of that trait in the population. And so we're going to look at in each case is before selection. So we're assuming that the selection has not acted yet, that directional selection has not acted yet. And so that sort of dotted line, dashed line is the frequency distribution before selection happens. And then I'll ask you to kind of think about what you would expect that selection or that frequency distribution to look like after selection has acted. So in this case, before selection is active, we've got this nice bell-shaped curve. So most individuals are in this sort of middle trait value here, with fewer individuals with high or low extremes. So think about what you would expect that, how would you expect that distribution to shift or to change, if you do expect it to change, when this mode of selection has taken place, when there's selection favoring for extreme individuals with a sort of higher fitness. So take a second to think about that, maybe draw that out and see what you might expect it to look like. And here it goes. So pause it if you haven't done that already. So this is what we might expect. So what we would expect is sort of a positive shift in that distribution, so that individuals with higher fitness tend to have more offspring, and that causes that distribution to shift. So now we're sort of selectively disfavoring individuals at the lower end of the spectrum and favoring individuals at the higher end of the spectrum, so they become more frequent, okay, more common in that population because they're surviving better and because they're having more offspring. Okay, disruptive selection. This is when individuals with those extreme values at both ends of the spectrum have the highest fitness. So in contrast to this one where fitness sort of increases as that trait value increases, here it's this kind of U-shaped curve where we have this sort of inverted bell-shaped curve where we have favoring individuals favored on either end or either extreme of that population. Excuse me. So again, at the bottom, if we're talking about a population with this kind of bell-shaped curve to begin with, how would you expect that to look after selection, after this disruptive selection has occurred? And if you said something like this, then you would be right. So what we'd expect here is that these individuals in the middle who have the lowest fitness would decrease in frequency in that population, and then the individuals at the extreme would increase in their frequency. Okay, so stabilizing selection, this is where there's selection for individuals in that middle, with those intermediate trait values. So again, take a second, pause, and think about how you might expect this distribution to change. And here under stabilizing selection, we would expect it to just become more and more narrow as individuals in those with those intermediate trait values have highest fitness. Okay, so this is an example of some research looking at directional selection. We'll go through this really quick. This is some of my research from my PhD. So the question here was, do different predation environments result in directional selection on swimming performance, locomotor performance, in these brachyrhynchus fishes? Okay, so these are fish, small live-bearing fish from Central America, and they live in either environments with lots of predators or without many predators. So you can think of this, kind of the question here is, do we see these sort of morphologies, similar morphologies that we see in humans that favor sort of one extreme locomotor style sprinting versus the other, which would be sort of this long distance endurance running? Do we see the same kind of thing? We see different morphologies favoring different locomotor types. Some humans, the human morphology that's sort of ideal for long distance running is quite a bit different from that morphology of sprinters. So we did this by measuring burst speed and also by measuring endurance. So we measured burst speed by startling these fish with a little acrylic hammer, and we filmed them with a high-speed camera to see how fast they went, how fast they responded to that startling, sort of that disruptive behavior. And then we also put fish in a swim chamber here at the bottom, which is basically like a treadmill for fish to see how well they could swim, how much endurance they had at sort of that steady swimming velocity. And we also looked at different kinematic variables in terms of what their body shape was like while they were swimming. Okay, so sorry, picking up where we left off here. So we were looking at burst speed swimming and also different their endurance speed, endurance swimming ability, and then different kinematic variables that influenced their swimming endurance and their efficiency. And we also were interested in looking at the relationship between body shape and these variables. So we collected specimens from 15 different populations throughout Costa Rica and Panama. So in this case, we were collecting from high and low predation environments. So these are parts of streams that have lots of big predators, where mortality rates are really high, and then other parts of the stream that had fewer predators and really low mortality rates. So this is kind of a comparative approach, like we talked about last time, where we're trying to understand how these traits are evolving by looking at species or populations that live in different environments and comparing them to each other. So what we found is that the morphology, the body shape, it did indeed differ between high and low predation environments. So on the left here, these are high and low predation populations within a species of Brachyraphis rhabdophora. And then on the right, these are sister species. And these sister species either live in high or low predation environments. So Brachyraphis roseni only lives in high predation environment here in the top right, and then Terbensis only lives in low predation environment in the bottom right here. So what we found is in these high predation environments, the caudal peduncle region, this sort of tail region, tended to be enlarged relative to these low predation populations, and that is thought to play a role in that burst speed swimming ability. So we're looking at directional selection on body shape here. So the question was, did body shape have a direct impact on swimming performance? And did that impact survival? Was there direct selection on a body shape that on burst speed swimming, such that individuals with higher burst speed swimming abilities were favored, and therefore the individuals with body shapes that were conducive to that burst speed swimming were also favored. We also looked at direct selection on body shape. So is there a particular body shape that predators prefer, or is it just this kind of indirect pathway by which predators are selecting for individuals or causing individuals with higher burst speeds to be favored, and that then favors certain body shapes. So to look at that selection pressure, the relative fitness of those individuals, we did some predator mesocosms, and this is basically we created these artificial pools with big predators, lots of hiding spots, and then we introduced these different prey fish into those pools and allowed them to interact with the predator for a couple days, and then we came back and looked and see who survived. So what we found was, this is going back to the burst speed swimming, so in gray, and I'll just have you can kind of pause this for a second and take a look at it and make sure you understand what's going on here. So I've got burst speed on the y-axis, and then these are the 4 different populations that we were looking at, high and low predation populations in these 2 different pairs. So high predation populations here in gray had really fast, really high burst speed swimming abilities relative to their low predation counterparts. And then this comparison here, this little bar right here is, which you'll see a lot in our graphs, indicates that they were significantly different. So if you remember here, our probability of there being no difference is very small. It's less than 0.001, so less than 0.1%. And when we look at survival rate after 48 hours, both within and between species, when we look at these high versus low predation comparisons, and this is just splitting it up by males and females, you can see that the high predation in gray all had significantly higher survival rates than low predation populations. to see if there was directional selection on those traits. I did what's called a path analysis. So this basically does kind of multivariate regression, looking at the relationships between lots of different variables. So in this case, we're looking at how body shape influenced burst speed, how size influenced burst speed, and how burst speed influenced survival. And what we found was that that body shape had a strong influence, a significant influence on burst speed, and then that burst speed had a significant influence on survival. So if you had a body shape that if you had a bigger caudal peduncle region, you were faster, and you were also therefore more likely to survive. So this was an example of sort of that directional selection where higher burst speeds were favored, lower burst speeds were disfavored in that high predation environment. Okay, disruptive selection on spadefoot tadpoles. This is another little sort of featured research that we'll talk about, and this actually comes out of my postdoc lab. David and Corinne Finnig were my postdoctoral advisors at UNC Chapel Hill. And what they study is, and David Finnig studies more these tadpoles a little bit more than Corinne does. They look at these tadpoles of spadefoot toads, and there are two different morphs. There are omnivorous morphs, which eat just about anything, and then carnivorous morphs, which eat mainly shrimp and then also other tadpoles. So the hypothesis here was that disruptive selection was acting on tadpole morphology and feeding behavior, so that you had sort of two extremes being favored along that sort of morphological continuum. And this would lead to two predictions. First, that omnivore morphs should feed more efficiently than intermediate morphs. So those are intermediate morphs kind of between this omnivorous and carnivorous morphology. That they should feed more efficiently on detritus. So detritus is just like rotting plant matter. So that's a preferred dietary item of omnivorous tadpoles. And then likewise, carnivorous morphs should feed more efficiently than intermediate morphs on invertebrates. Okay, so basically, if you're a carnivore, if you're on one extreme, you should be doing better on that type of food item than the intermediate morphs. And then same thing if you're an omnivore, if you're on the other extreme, you should be doing better than those intermediate morphs. Those intermediate morphs would be kind of a, you've heard the phrase maybe a jack of all trades, but a master of none. So these are individuals who are okay at both foraging types, but they're not as good as those specialists. Second prediction would be that omnivores and carnivore morphs have higher fitness than intermediate morphs. And that's as a result of kind of that trade-off that we just mentioned. So to do this, they collected spadefoot toads. They allowed omnivores to consume detritus and small invertebrates. They allowed carnivores to consume invertebrates. And then intermediates, they're generalists, so they eat both detritus, small vertebrates, and small invertebrates, and then larger invertebrates. They looked at feeding efficiency, and then they also measured survivorship in sort of these competitive pools with lots of different tadpoles. So what they found was, excuse me, that feeding performance and growth rates of the specialized morphs were higher than those of intermediate morphs. So there's two different graphs here. One is looking at performance on detritus on the left, and the other is looking at performance on shrimp on the right. And so on the left, the more omnivore-like you were, the better you were at performing on detritus. So it's over on the left there, the top left of that graph. And then that performance decreases as you become more carnivore-like. And then you see the opposite pattern on the other side. So as carnivore morphs have higher growth rates when they're feeding on invertebrates than the omnivores do. And they also had, those intermediate morphotypes had lower survivorship. So you can see that in the top right graph in the center there. And then also in the bottom right, this is a model looking at the size, which was a proxy for fitness, and then also how carnivore-like they were. So you could see that there was sort of this pattern of disruptive selection where individuals with a specialized morphology, either more carnivore-like or more omnivore-like, did better than those individuals who were in the middle. They were of the smallest size. So a cool example from sort of experimental work looking at disruptive selection. Okay, so the last thing we'll talk about here is sexual selection, and discuss it as sort of an example of natural selection. Sorry, it's getting late, and I've been talking a lot today, and I'm coming down with a cold, so I'm kind of dragging. Anyway, we'll finish this up, and then we'll be done. So what sexual selection does is it focuses on this part of natural selection focuses on the reproductive fitness of individuals. So not just the survival, but it focuses specifically on traits that are related to reproductive fitness. So sexual selection acts on heritable traits that affect reproduction, and these can be traits that are directly involved in reproduction or traits that are involved in mate choice or mate competition. And this often results in sexual dimorphism, which is when we see morphological, physical differences between the sexes. So males and females look dramatically different, and that's because they take on very different sex roles and parental care strategies. So one example here, just in this image, are red-collared widow birds. So on the left is a male. He's got this really bright red collar around his head, and he has a very extended tail feathers, whereas the female is quite bland, quite drab, has short tail feathers, and so forth. So you tend to see this when sexual selection is strong. You tend to see a stronger sexual dimorphism. So we'll look at an example of this is some well-known research in sexual selection on widow birds. So the question here was, is the long tail of male red-collared widow birds, a result of sexual selection? So there's this trait that we see quite often in nature in these widow birds. Is that indicative of sexual selection? Sorry, I'm just getting a drink. Walking around with my computer, getting a drink. Okay, so the hypothesis in this case that these researchers were looking at is that tail length is a sexually selected trait in males. So you see this really dramatic sexual dimorphism, and they hypothesized that it was under sexual selection. Prediction is that females should prefer to mate with males that have the longest tails. Oops. Okay, so normally right here we'd have a discussion. So I want you to just pause this for a second and think about this and jot some notes down. If you're with a friend, have a quick discussion. We can talk about this more in class if you have any questions about it. But think about this. How would you test if tail length is a sexual selected trait or sexually selected trait? Think about that for a minute. And I'm going to drink my Coke. Okay, we're going to keep going. So if you haven't thought about that, hit pause. How these researchers approached it was that they measured the tail length of males defending different territories. And then they recorded the number of females that were nesting on each male's territory as an indication of the preference by those females for those males with different traits. And what they found was that tail, well, here, you have a look. So here's the results. So we've got tail length on the x-axis with smaller tail lengths on the left, larger tail lengths on the right, and then the number of active nests that were found in a male's territory there on the y-axis. So is tail length under sexual selection? Based on these results, what do you think? Take a second, have a look at them, digest this, and think about what this is telling us. So yes, this is suggestive that males or that sexual selection is acting on these traits because males with the longest tails also had the highest mating success. So they were attracting more females to their territories in part because they had these longer tails. I'll post a link to this video, but this is just kind of a fun video looking at sexual selection in birds of paradise, and what we see is that in species that have really strong sexual selection, this can drive really rapid speciation. So in these birds of paradise, for example, we've got lots of species that have evolved within a relatively small area in a relatively short amount of time. And in all of these, sexual selection is very strong. And what I mean by that is that individuals, that males, certain males, when sexual selection is very strong, they tend to have really high reproductive success, where other males might not have any reproductive success at all. So that's what we mean when we say that sexual selection is very strong, is that there's a lot of variation in reproductive success within a population. Okay, so divergent sexual selection is when sexual selection acts on traits that are associated with mate choice. And what is predicted is that changes in sexual selection can cause really rapid reproductive isolation and lead to rapid divergence between two populations if individuals in these populations differ in how they acquire mates. So if females select, we'll talk about this a bit more here. So if females select a mate based on, let's say, the coloration of the feathers on your head. And if some males have really high reproductive success and others have really low reproductive success, then there's potential for those traits to change really quickly, because you might have a new mutation that leads to a new trait, a new feather color, for example. And if that's preferred by the females, then that can become really common in that population very quickly if they're very successful. So if you have two different populations of a species, each of which could have, by random chance, some new trait pop up in a population just due to some random mutation, those populations could really quickly diverge from each other because females are preferring these traits that are popping up sort of randomly and that differ between those populations. Okay, and we could talk about this, digest this a little bit more when I get back in class, but the gist of it here, the main point here, is that you can have this really rapid reproductive isolation evolve because populations can very quickly evolve different traits or preference for different traits such that they won't recognize each other as mates, and then they'll become sort of new species. So there's some evidence of this, of sexual selection's role in speciation, when we look at different sister clades of birds that differ in their mating system. So in clades that mate promiscuously, so birds of paradise, for example, or hummingbirds, these are species that have, really charismatic coloration, really charismatic feathers, and they tend to have and sexual selection tends to be very high in these species. So some males are super successful and other males are not very successful. They tend to have more species in those groups than related clades do, related groups do, that don't have don't mate promiscuously. Okay, so if you look at swifts or these manicodes, these species tend to have less sexual dimorphism. They tend to have less variation in reproductive success among the males, and that's often because these males and females will breed together, will breed and help raise their offspring together. So you have sort of this cooperative brood care and oftentimes monogamy. So males and females will form sort of a pair, and they'll bond and they will mate together for many years. And in that case, you have less variation in reproductive success. So male only has one mate instead of a male potentially having many mates in such cases as the birds of paradise or the hummingbirds. So under those situations, you can have really fast sexual selection evolve. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, please email me. I will get these slides posted and we could talk more about this when I get back. But this is all the material that I expect you guys to cover before I get back on the, whenever it is, the 17th. Okay, take it easy, have a good one, and good luck with all of this material. Adios.